So yeah, this is going to present a theory of cognitive decline and dementia. And I apologize. So I just finished putting these slides together. So this is my first time going through them along with you. So bear with me. Hopefully I'll get my ideas across. Disclosure. So some of you know I have a neuroscience-based music education company. And one of the next phases of that company is to try to address or to provide some solutions to the problems I'm going to put forth in this talk. All right, so let's start with some unexplained issues. One is that we know that cognitive function tends to decline with age, and as does the risk of dementia. So refer to these two things in this talk: age-related cognitive decline, age-related dementia. Under age-related dementia, the most prominent is going to be Alzheimer's disease. So if we look at sort of the cognitive function there on the right, you have a few different cognitive domains you might care about. You see that they kind of peak in early adulthood, and then they steadily decline on average. Talk a little bit more about that. And so, like I said, the risk of dementia increases sharply with age. It is by far the biggest risk factor, dwarfing anything else we might think about. So relatively negligible before the age of 65, and then by the 85 plus, it's almost half. And of course, this is all because we have no idea. So, and that is in spite of a massive amount of research, of time, energy, money, etc. So I would argue that this means that we have missed a key driver of this process. And I think there are multiple lines of evidence that would indicate that we have a blind spot. So something is missing in our understanding of these conditions. And so this talk in part an attempt to create a theory that incorporates that blind spot. So there's some unresolved questions I think that any kind of theory must answer about the characteristics of these entities. So one is, why does cognitive function and dementia, why does cognitive function decline with age? Why does dementia rise with age? And why is it non-existent in youth? And then what causes dementia? So if we were to characterize kind of the prevailing ideas about these things, age-related cognitive decline is typically considered just part of getting old. It's an inevitable, maybe partially modifiable part of the aging process. And then age-related dementias, maybe there's some genetic predisposition, and then there's some kind of causative agent or smoking gun. And the project in research has been almost exclusively towards trying to figure out what that smoking gun is. The idea being, if we can understand that, we can then treat it with some drug that targets the right molecule, and we'll have our cure. So how's this going so far? Super? Super? Shit. All right, so if we chart our progress over dollars spent, we see a pretty flat line. So yeah, in spite of all that, these are the last minute slides that I had to take a picture of. So the reason that's almost exclusively given for why we haven't made more progress is we don't have enough money yet. So there's just so many targets we have to investigate, so many treatments directed at those that we have to try, and we just don't have enough money yet. I would contend that perhaps we've been bamboozled. This gets to what Dan was talking about earlier with adaptability. This is a quote from Carl Sagan. One of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. So the old bamboozles tend to persist as the new ones arise. So I think that if we could remove any human tendency, I might argue that this is the one that we should go after the most, our reluctance to discard bad ideas in the face of evidence. So I would suggest that the reason we haven't made progress is we've been looking in the wrong place. So Willie Sutton said, if you rob banks because that's where the money was. So I don't think our problem is a lack of funding. I think it's because we've been looking in the wrong place. To illustrate that, very good. So how did that happen? If I were an alien, I like alien metaphors, and I wanted to, and I was trying to figure out what just happened that made you guys all raise your hands on the screen. If you had to choose between what you think might be more likely to give that explanation, would it be some understanding of the nature of symbols and human language? Or would it be a really, really detailed pixel map of the screen? Who votes for A? So the point to make here is that, and this gets exactly to what Brett is talking about with proximate and ultimate levels of explanation, is that there are, every phenomenon has a level of explanation that's appropriate for understanding. And it's really, really important to get that right, or else you'll never get to any level of understanding. Just like creating more and more detailed pixel maps will never get you to understand why everybody in this room just raised their hand. So the big problem in so much of medicine and biological sciences, in my opinion, is that we have seen the molecular cellular level of explanation as a privileged level of explanation, when in reality every level is a choice and every level is a decision based on the phenomenon of interest. So, for example, you could explain something at every possible level of biological organization. So, you know, if you're designing to explain things at the level of the cell or at the level of genes, you're still making a decision. You could go all the way down to subatomic particles if you wanted to. So we've just kind of decided that the level that we focused on the most is the privilege level, rather than making a decision based on whether it's most appropriate for the phenomenon of interest. So the point being, every level is a choice, and there are no privileged levels of explanation.
So what do you mean by that?
It means privileged in terms of best, always best level, right? So we kind of think that the molecular level, we're drawn to that in biological sciences as being the best level to explain a phenomenon, that will unlock the most understanding, right? But just like that's like the pixel map, right? In that particular phenomenon, there are ones that would not, where that will not be true. So this is a molecular model of Alzheimer's disease. It is not an explanation. It makes us feel smart and accomplished, but it hasn't really contributed to our understanding the phenomenon anymore. This is, you know, continuing to create higher resolution pixel maps without any concept of words or letters or language to extend the metaphor. And we have no, it's not that this data couldn't be useful, but without any theory in which to put it into or framework to understand it, then it's not helping us in any way. So, you know, the last talk I gave was about a similar concept of the levels of intervention in terms of where it makes most sense to intervene in a biological system. So same kind of idea applies there. If we're looking to influence a particular biological phenomenon, there's also levels at which it's best to intervene. And the same applies in terms of unlocking understanding. This has been a problem that's increasingly recognized in the field of neuroscience. We've been accumulating more and more data at the kind of granular level, and this was a paper that was published back in 2017, because despite that proliferation in data, we weren't making much progress in terms of our understanding of the brain. And still, even in that field, the reason often given is we just need more data. So this was an article that was, or a study that was done using the conventional methods of neuroscience to see if that would allow us to understand the microprocessor. We know how that works. We know how it's structured. So could you take data from a microprocessor like we do in the brain and reverse engineer it, figure out how it works? So those are just some gains in the output over time. It's being tracked. And the answer was no. So they were able to reveal some interesting structure in the data, but could not meaningfully describe the hierarchy of information processing in the microprocessor. So translation, they can describe what's happening really well, but they don't understand it. And the problem is brains are much more complicated than microprocessors. So there's been a response to this problem. It's been increasingly recognized. There's a emerging field of systems neuroscience to deal with this, to try to get at higher levels of explanation for these phenomena, so we can create theories to make sense of all the data that we're acquiring. So back to our topics. For age-related cognitive decline, it's the abbreviation there. What might we say? What might our view about this be? And just like Brett said, we don't really know what the natural course of aging is in modern humans because of the confound of mismatch. So despite the fact that everybody attributes so much to aging, we still don't really understand what that even means. And then for age-related dementias, we would consider them a mismatch disease, that they are due to breakdown of regulatory systems due to novel stressors. And we know that there's a significantly less, what data we have, incidence in indigenous populations. And we know that the big mismatches in our modern environment are big risk factors for these conditions. So our paradigm would be to reduce mismatch and then influence all these cellular and molecular signatures of dementia that we are a long way off from understanding. But another way, if we consider that the probability of disease rises with a degree of mismatch, you might say that starts in post-reproduction, when the forces of natural selection begin to decline.
You presume it's linear.
Yeah, this is not, don't assume that I mean it's linear. This is just the relationship.
It could be, you could have,
although you can tell,
log axes.
What's that? Yeah, this law, yeah. You make it work. You make it work in your mind. That's fine. It's like a Rorschach. All right. So this was the therapeutic algorithm for sort of encapsulating the ancestral approach to therapies that I presented here last year. So Brett talked a little bit about the metaphor used there between game level and source code level intervention. So a game level intervention be something that's sort of operating at the level of evolutionary forces. In the analogy of a video game, it's just playing the game, learning how to play the game by playing the game. Whereas a source code would be directed towards the underlying code for the game. So in the biological terms, that would be finding molecular targets to go after, to influence. So if we were to break those down into quadrants, we have interventions that are either game level or source code level interventions. And then the goal of those interventions being either supportive, meaning we're trying to amplify or augment something the body is already trying to do, versus something that's disruptive or exploitative. So we are disrupting some system because we believe that doing so is better than sort of the status quo. And exploitative being where we know about some physiological phenomenon and we're trying to influence it in some way that we think is beneficial. So with those in mind, our algorithm would be to start, that we would always prefer, quadrant 1 interventions. That's where we start. So game level interventions that are supportive, and that's primarily things that we would do, lifestyle and diet interventions that will minimize mismatch. And then game level disruptive or exploitative might be other things that we do, like sauna or Wim Hof breathing, or any number of things that we can think of that are game level and that are exploiting some kind of physiological mechanism that we've discovered. And then the last in our category would be disruptive source code interventions, which comprise mostly pharmaceuticals. So almost every pharmaceutical is designed to disrupt some physiological process because we think that's the right thing to do. Yeah, for time. But that would be, so that would be things that are supportive with source code level, so supplements, things like that. Especially in the case of where you think there may be a nutritional deficiency. So just to review why, in principle, we would have that algorithm. One, because game level interventions are going to engage evolved regulatory mechanisms. So these are forces that we've been evolving with for a very long time. We have not evolved at all with source code level interventions. So they're much more, they're much riskier, and they're less influential. So game level interventions act upstream and impact many pathways, and source code interventions are weaker, acting downstream with a narrow scope of influence and with unknown influences that we can't possibly predict. Here's kind of another way of broadly characterizing our philosophical differences. Modern medicines is kind of identify the problems and try to solve them ourselves. And ours is to try to understand what the body needs to solve its own problems. So in other words, our evolved wisdom is is much smarter than our rational brain. I was reminded of Chris's talk today. Same kind of thing where we're trying to interfere with what the brain's trying to do during development. And just the point is, get out of the brain's way. There's millions of years of evolved wisdom there. We're not that smart, and when we interfere at our own risk. Okay, so since these are age-related phenomena, here we go, talking about the aging process again. And as kind of, I think Brett's talk exemplified, it's kind of a gnarly concept to try to get your head around. And as Dan had a great quote about the power of definitions, they really do matter, and they've profoundly shaped how we think about aging. So I think it's important to be careful in what we lump under this umbrella. So the broadest thing we might say is they're just changes that are associated with age. But if we're wanting to kind of study it as a mechanism, we want a more precise definition. So we might think of things that cause biological degradation over time, and that it's just one component of that. So we might think of that component as degradation that occurs in a biological system, irrespective of its environment or the factors that account for differences in lifespan across species. And you gave the analogy of rust. So I think a common conception I had, maybe other people have, is just kind of like what happens to your car and your appliance just with use, right? So that's kind of how we probably think of the aging process. So you reviewed this already in the field of aging. A lot of the mechanisms that are associated with it are pretty focused on DNA, DNA damage, telomere attrition, epigenome alterations, and so on. So for me, kind of getting to thinking about this in a way that I thought was useful and accurate required kind of going back to first principles and thinking about it from there. So as Rhett mentioned, Newton's second law of thermodynamics says that entropy is always increasing over time. So systems are always becoming more disordered. Living systems are the most highly ordered form of matter we know. Quote comes from a book called Science Matters. And the most highly ordered system in the known universe is this. So that shows what we're up against. And so this the second law of thermodynamics would say there's simply going to be increasing disorder over time until death. It gets worse, I think. But all is not lost, because the second law refers to isolated systems. So you can reverse entropy by adding energy back into the system, which we do. So there isn't nothing about the fundamental laws of the universe that says we have to age. We could theoretically go until the heat death of the universe, all molecules, fuels stop moving. So what really there is, or how I like to think of it, is that there's a battle of forces in the biological system. You have forces of disorder that are breaking things down, and then you have forces of order that are repairing things and restoring things. And you can imagine these as a balance between scales. So you've got imbalance between, if the forces of order outweigh the forces of, or sorry, the other way around, forces of disorder outweigh forces of order, then you have degradation. So in youth, we have balanced scales, and then once the balance is thrown off, we begin to age. So this is kind of what happens to the integrity of the brain and the nervous system over time, stable in early life, and then it begins to deteriorate. And so, as I mentioned, we would argue that the best way to mitigate that decline is to minimize mismatch. So if we would have a high mismatch environment, then that pace of degradation will be high. In a low mismatch environment, it will be its lowest. That's the best way we know of right now to influence the balance of the entropy equilibrium. So another way to say it would be that the rate of degradation over time will be lowest in an organism's ancestral habitat, barring additional efforts to slow or arrest the aging process. So when we decrease mismatch, we're conceivably increasing those forces of order by supporting repair and recovery mechanisms, and we're decreasing the disruptive forces of disorder. There's still the question of why is it balanced in youth? So back to the original conception, of thinking of aging as a distinct process that's sort of environmentally independent, like we might think of a car or an appliance. I don't come to the conclusion that it's better to think of it like we now do about genes and environment. There really isn't anything that's environmentally independent, that even our genes are simply specifying a set of instructions for a particular environment. So breaking them off into discrete categories doesn't make sense, and I think it leads to problems when we do that. So the things that I think arise when we consider the aging process as different in kind or some kind of environmentally inexorable force of degradation. One, I just don't think it's accurate, because I don't think there is such a thing as an environmentally independent force. And if we imprecisely define it or put too many things into it, we attribute too much of it. We know, we would argue strongly that that's already happening as our recent discussion. It's led us to overlook the role of mismatch and simply attribute everything that we see with age to the nebulous aging process. So it leads to this sense of fatalism and inevitability that leads to inaction in our patients. And it also may lead us to focus on the aging mechanisms without focusing on the things that are compromising our health span and our function and vitality. So it could lead to us prolonging lifespan without prolonging health span. So then the question becomes, with this kind of definition in mind, what are the factors that drive this entropy equilibrium? So what promotes disorder and what promotes order? I think it's worth pointing out that almost all of our progress in medicine has been on age-independent conditions. So things like reducing infant and childhood mortality, infectious diseases. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of this inappropriate categorization of the aging processes, all-encompassing, and because of our tendency, like Dan talked about, thinking of health and disease as binary concepts rather than simply a continuum, rather than where you are on this entropy and equilibrium.
Josh's idea.
So one of the challenges of figuring out brain aging, so what we want to really know is, what's the rate of degradation in the brain over time. We use cognitive function as a proxy for that. Somewhat limited because of the fact that our brains can learn. So our brains can compensate for biological degradation. So there's my scientific scatter plot. Those are different individuals. So you can see that they might have differing levels of neurobiological degeneration over time and very differing cognitive functions. So the overall trend will be with more degradation. You're going to see more decline in function, but there's a lot of variability there. And this is unlike the situation with most other organs where your function is going to be pretty tightly linked to your biological integrity. And this is one reason why there's a lot of inconsistency between MRI findings and cognition. There are probably, there are certain measures that are more kind of the elemental, they're elements of cognitive function that are more stable than others, but still malleable. So with that in mind, here's what we know about cognitive function over time. The decline typically starts around the 5th decade of life, and then it tends to accelerate over time. But there's lots of individual variability. There are some people who show virtually no cognitive decline at all. And then neurobiologically, there are multiple things that have been proposed as correlates of that functional decline. It needn't be any one thing, and maybe all of it. So things like neuronal loss, depletion of neurotransmitters, white matter loss has been proposed to maybe correlate the best with age-related cognitive decline metrics. So to summarize kind of the important observations about age-related cognitive decline, it's stable. Cognition is stable in childhood and early adulthood, usually starts in middle age, tends to accelerate once it starts. The decline is highly variable, not universal. And also the mechanisms of that degeneration are under regulatory control. So we do have repair mechanisms for all those things. If we look at dementia, we find a very similar temporal evolution, though the time of the age of onset is greater. So virtually none prior to 65, and then the rate doubles about every 5 to 10 years. And then most certainly the rate of decline tends to accelerate over time.
What did you mean when you said we have regulatory mechanisms for all of those factors?
For the factors for the neurobiological degradation, I mean, we have repair mechanisms for them.
For amyloid?
Yes, we have. Yes, we do. For amyloid, I'll get to that in a minute, but for deposition and clearance of amyloid.
Well, Bredeson's whole model is the balance or imbalance between creation and clearance.
Right. Yep. Clearance is slow. So these are some of the various pathological findings that have been associated with Alzheimer's disease. Their role is still unclear. The big targets have been amyloid and neurofibrillary tangles, but efforts directed towards preventing amyloid deposition have been unsuccessful so far. So beta amyloid is a waste product of normal metabolism. Its clearance does diminish with age. And we know that Alzheimer's patients have impaired clearance. It's cleared via the CSF, and their levels are reduced. So,
Sorry, real quick.
Yeah.
On the amyloid, back to that screen, is the one question that comes up is the amyloid clearance diminishing because amyloid is actually doing something to prevent a worse problem, right? So
Maybe.
Right. It's actually like.
right, that could be an explanation. I think the point I want to make simply is that this is not some exogenous factor that we have no mechanisms for handling.
Right. Well, the question also I'm saying is like maybe the amyloid is actually
Right.
preventing the worst thing. So right. So
Mechanistically, there are lots of explanations for what's happening. Yeah. So to summarize, then we could say that age-related dementias can be described as a significant accelerating disruption in the entropy equilibrium in the brain caused by multiple factors. And a smoking gun is unlikely. And that disruption could be either from an increase in the forces of disorder, or it can be a decrease in the forces of order. So if we downregulate our repair and recovery mechanisms, the same will also happen. So in graphical form, with our scales, if we increase the forces of disorder, they will be thrown out of balance, or we can reduce the forces of order to throw them out of balance. Both situations will lead to neurobiological degradation.
But what's a force of order? I understand creation versus clearance, but the concept.
Repairing something.
So decreased repair.
So decrease, right, exactly. Decreasing repair. So other crucial observations is that decline in Alzheimer's disease continues despite efforts to reduce the force of disorder. So usually when someone gets diagnosed, become more aggressive with their management of their risk factors, but they continue to decline. We haven't identified any unique environmental exposure, so no exogenous compound that we know of that we can handle. There are many routes to age-related dementia, so no variation. I mean, many variations in terms of the individual histories. The only universal risk factor is age, and the disparity in the incidence between childhood and adulthood suggests that there's a driving factor unique to the adult environment. So what could that be? So for the past several decades, there has been a growing body of evidence linking cognitive activity and cognitive demands to a protective benefit against dementia and cognitive decline. This was kind of kicked off by the NUN study, which was started in 1986. It was a cohort of sisters and I think 300 or so, and they all volunteered to have their cognitive function tracked over time and their brains studied after death. And the kind of first notable finding was that more complex writing in early lives, in their 20s, and that was measured by a characteristic called idea density. The greater the idea density in their writing, the lower their risk of Alzheimer's later on. And one of the famous subjects was Sister Mary, who continued to teach until her mid-80s, continued to be intellectually vigorous until she died in her hundreds. But her brain had plenty of pathology. Lots of other studies have been done since then on this phenomenon, and generally showing that higher levels of education seem to be associated with some reduction in risk, as are occupational complexity and cognitive leisure activities. So this line of research kind of spawned the era of brain games for brain health. So the idea of continuing to challenge your brain with puzzles and so forth. And this become already accepted as kind of a universal good, even though, back when this research first started, people didn't really think there was a connection between cognitive decline, dementia, and how cognitively active you were. The specific research on how protective those sorts of things are has been variable. This was a study that made big splash a couple of years ago studying lumosity. So they had young adult subjects who did either lumosity for 10 weeks or non-specific, non-adaptive video games, not adapting to their level to try to progressively improve their skills. And they did cognitive testing and fMRI during decision-making tasks at the beginning and completion of the study, and there was no difference in performance between the two groups. There was also a $2 million lawsuit against lumosity for overstating its claims for preventing cognitive decline and dementia, because it hasn't been shown to do that yet. So the question has been, why is this protective? Why does cognitive activity protect us against age-related cognitive decline and dementia? And the primary theory has been is referred to as cognitive reserve. So essentially, it's the idea that you're building redundancy in the system, or you're creating a backup. So kind of like a plane with dual engines. If one goes out, it can still fly without, and that other engine can compensate for it. So you have all these compensations that even if one part of the brain gets hit with some pathology, other parts can compensate for it. So therefore, a cognitively demanding existence leads to a more robust brain via our known mechanisms for learning and neuroplasticity. We'll like to cite this particular study when they talk about the effects of learning and cognitive reserve. So this was a study of London taxi drivers who have to memorize the street map, I think within a 6-mile radius of Charing Cross station.
The knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. So, and it's, I don't know, it takes like 3 or 4 years to go through this, and then they're tested. And so they did studies before and after, and showing that their hippocampi grow. So you can see the before and after on that first graph of the trainees that actually qualified, their hippocampi growth. So, and the idea here being, so this is the phenomenon that allows you to create backup systems or create more redundancy to withstand pathology. But there's more to this story. Evidence that indicates that this explanation is probably incomplete. So one limitation or insufficiency of the theory is that the benefits of cognitive activity aren't domain specific. So you would think that if you're building redundancy, it should be for whatever particular domain you've been heavily active in. The research suggests that things like a cognitively demanding life and physical activity are not domain specific. And we know that the age-related cognitive decline and age-related dementias are multi-domains. You need multiple domains to be impaired to meet those conditions. One of the first areas of research that suggests something more may be going on was research on rats in enriched environments, where they would show improvements in brain health initially, and then along the way showed that that was improving survival of neurons. And in this particular study, it was linked to an enriched environment linked to increases in nerve growth factor in the hippocampus. So potentially not just building robustness, but improving the survival and existence of health of the existing neurons. Now, this I think is the most extraordinary study you've probably never heard about. This was performed by Michael Merzenich and his colleagues. He is, if you don't know that name, he's referred to sometimes as the father of neuroplasticity. So he is, the fact that we all recognize this as a phenomenon that happens in the brain, it can still happen in adulthood, is largely as a result of, or his work was instrumental in ushering in that paradigm shift. And he was ridiculed for it and ostracized for a long time until he finally put together enough research to show that indeed brains can continue to change throughout our lifespan. This study, which was performed in 2010, they performed auditory training for an hour a day for 1 month in the brown Norway rat, which is a model that's been used for cognitive aging. To improve the auditory signal noise detection and frequency resolution in healthy aged rats. So they're looking at aged versus young rats. And what they found was that over 20 auditory processing deficits in the adult versus young brain existed before training. There was degradation of the sensory maps in multiple processing domains, and the functional deficits were paralleled with negative structural changes, including in PV staining inhibitory neurons and in myelination. So multiple functional and structural degradations. The month of training substantially or completely reversed both the structural and functional changes. So 1 month of training reversed the functional and structural signatures of aging in the brain.
Outside of auditory tracts, was only auditory tracts or auditory in other areas?
Just auditory training. They were limited to the
No,
auditory
but
system.
this structural change.
Yeah, right. These are all related to
Auditory process.
auditory processing. This is the staining of the PV neurons. And I don't know how well you can see it, but the top you can see in the pointer. So that was these are the PV1 plus neurons staining in before training and then increasing in after training. You can see that here represented in this graph before and after. So just from the auditory procedure. So there's a quote from the study. One of the most striking findings is that every aspect of sound processing we examined in the aging A1, which is the region of the brain for auditory processing, was degraded and then substantially reversed with a simple training strategy. Realizing that hundreds of different molecular and structural elements are needed to support these coordinated cortical changes, it appears very unlikely that purely random independent events are the cause of their degeneration with age. So there's some upstream force. So the keys from that are that sustained reduction in demands with age drove widespread structural and functional degradation in the brain, and then sustained increase in demands restored widespread structural and functional degradation in the brain. Some studies in humans on this phenomenon. We know that physical activity reduces plasma beta amyloid 42, the one we don't want. And then we know there have been studies showing cognitive activity is associated with reduced beta amyloid on PET independent of physical activity. So again, it was just more than just the cognitive reserve explanation. So altogether, I would say that it's not just cognitive reserve that's happening with increasing cognitive demands, but hardware restoration. So in a cognitively demanding environment, we have upregulated forces of repair and recovery or forces of order to balance our scales. In a non-demanding environment, those regulatory forces go down. And so degradation ensues. So this altogether suggests the presence of a mechanism controlling this. I want to call it a switch, but it's more accurate to call it a slider, because it probably is analog in nature. And we know that these sorts of regulatory switches are all over the place in biology. And the data indicates that the position of this particular switch is driven by our cognitive demands. So let's look at it with this idea of the regulatory slider. We have reduced demands. We're going to reduce our repair signal. We reduce our repair signal. We're going to increase the rate of neurobiological degradation. If that's going up, then we're constraining the scope of our demands. So if you
real quick, on the demands part, of reducing demands, does reducing demand not just decrease the repair, but it also can prevent damage happening in the first place? So not just repair, but is there something that demanding something from the brain can decrease inflammation or decrease the damage that's actually occurring? Not necessarily just increase the repair that's happening.
You mean it's protecting its robustness in some way.
So
Yeah.
we're making it robust. Damage
Sure.
not just repair,
Sure. Yeah, that's conceivable too. So with this, you can see that we have a vicious cycle that ensues once your capacity has constrained the scope of what you can actually, what demands you can place on the system. You will have a feed-forward cycle. So you will have an accelerating decline.
A positive feedback.
Positive feedback loop, autocatalytic force. And again, that's what we see with these conditions. So you have this point where you're constraining the scope of demands, and then we often see an accelerating decline in these conditions, which would be consistent with there being a feed-forward cycle.
Like when people retire.
We'll get to that. So altogether, this indicates that cognitive demands are a fundamental driving force between age-related cognitive decline and age-related dementias, and evidence that this could be the single greatest driver. Yet, efforts thus far are primarily targeted towards reducing the forces of disorder rather than upregulating forces of order. So the implications from this model, if true, is that once cognitive capacity is reduced, cognitive decline will continue irrespective of mismatch reduction. And supporting, but on the other side, supporting repair and recovery mechanisms via mismatch reduction at any age will only matter if there is demand. So without the demand, the brain won't care. This is analogous to the situation with growing muscles. So if no amount of dietary protein you consume without demand will cause your muscles to grow. You must have the demand there with resistance training and the raw materials to then stimulate growth. So you could say that demand is a zero multiplier of efforts to build muscle or to preserve brain function and integrity.
Zero multiplier.
Multiply, what's that? Exactly. So if you don't want to stop there, then you can do 1,000, 100,000 brain function preservation efforts, and you'll still get zero. All right. So this would suggest that the position of your slider is determining your mismatch tolerance. So if you're in your youthful state, your slider's full on, recovery mechanisms are maximally activated, and you can tolerate high mismatch without degradation, possibly because of the declining forces of macular selection. And then if your slider is at zero, your scale is going to be imbalanced no matter what you do about minimizing mismatch if you don't have demands to still get your vicious cycle. Another way to state it would be that the influence of risk factors on cognitive decline will increase as cognitive demands diminish. So you're going to see the risk factors impact go up as cognitive demands go down because of your declining forces of order. So this is what I would refer to as the blind spot earlier, that our failure to account for the role that the forces of order or repair and recovery are playing in this process. Or our failure to realize that we must create the demand for repair and recovery with cognitive activity. So to review, the mechanisms that lead to age-related cognitive decline and age-related dementias are under regulatory control. So our brain doesn't know how to repair them. And those regulatory controls appear to be regulated by cognitive. So the working title of this is Demand-Driven Decline Theory. That cognitive demands regulate the position of the repair slider and determine our mismatch tolerance. And so it's the key driver of cognitive decline and dementia. This would explain why we see multiple pathologies that don't seem to be connected because they have an upstream cause. So downregulation of the repair mechanisms will lead to multiple pathological changes in multiple systems. So rather than any singular pathological change. And we're a long way off from understanding how those pathological changes lead to the conditions. So this is kind of a puzzling thing, that why would upkeep be so tied to our cognitive demands? So it's not necessary that be true. And this is a phenomenon that's not unique to the nervous system. So we know that the body degrades rapidly with disuse. So early retirement, for example, is associated with earlier death. So retiring at 55 in a cohort study, people were twice as likely to die before age 65 as those retiring after 60. Another study, 1 year older age at retirement is associated with 11% lower risk of all-cause mortality. So, and unhealthy retirees had a lower all-cause mortality risk when retiring later. So if you're unhealthy but you retire later, you stay alive longer.
How do you control for reverse causality there? People are retiring earlier because they're...
Yeah, that's, so they actually did adjust it for that in this one. Yeah, but yeah, that's obviously, has been the question for a long time, but then people have been trying to tease that out.
They retire early and travel more, they're exposed to more accidents.
And infectious.
Are they all dying of like bungee jumping in Thailand?
Could be.
They go on more cruises and eat more junk.
Yeah, well, yeah, the cruise effect could be big.
Or get more sexually transmitted disease.
Right. Can I continue?
Sorry.
There's also the widowhood effect. So the spouses are 66% increased chance of death in the first 3 months after a spouse's death. Worse for men. We know that hospital-acquired deconditioning is an enormous problem. So there's the added, so a day in the hospital takes 2 days of rehab. And it's been shown to lead to declines in strength, muscle mass, cognitive function, muscle protein synthesis, connective tissue, physical function. And that effect is more pronounced with age. The older you are, the more it takes out of you. So again, why does the body do this? Why does it decline? Why does it stop repairing itself in the face of reduced demands? Or why does disuse accelerate aging? So here we go with the grandmother hypothesis again. So this is, as we talked about before, it's posited to explain longevity of women after menopause. So if you're reproductive, if you're no longer reproducing, why are you still staying alive? And the idea being is that if you are increasing the fitness of your genetic relatives, then from your genes point of view, you are better off alive. There's a downside. The better off dead rule says that if you are lowering the fitness of your genetic relatives, then from your genes point of view, you're better off dead.
But what about the opposite in that, since we are one of the only mammals that actually go through conception of certain males, I mean, we would be living longer otherwise.
Whales being one species where the grandmother hypothesis is
Right, I
better
know.
understood.
So, yeah.
I mean, you're having increased competition also, so if
Right.
you go through menopause and you're increasing competition, maybe like a population effect that's lowering the ability of the whole population.
So this would suggest
Let's just kill ourselves.
So if you're in a tribe with fixed resources, in your post-reproductive years, once you are consuming more than you're contributing, once you are lowering the fitness of your relatives, then you're better off dead. So that would suggest that once your cognitive capacity or physical capacity hits a certain point, then your genes, it's wiser than to stop repairing and recovering. Stop driving those processes.
Did you come up with that?
Yeah. The better off dead.
How do our genes know how long we
But cognitive. So sorry, that's an important point. Cognitive demands. So if you are sitting around not doing anything, if you are dependent on others, you have to lead a completely cognitive and undemanding life. If that's a signal to your genome that you're not contributing. So if you have a highly cognitive demanding life, then that's a signal that you are active and you are likely increasing the fitness value value of your relatives.
So once the process kicks off, it basically accelerates.
Yeah,
itself.
exactly.
It's like
It's not-
self-destructive.
Right. Self-destruct if you stop. If you hit the better off dead zone.
So I better just stop, retire it.
That's not. That's actually not the. That's not the. That's not the solution. And yeah, we'll get to that.
You might imagine the sensitivity of these measurements is calibrated to the expected stressors of interacting in a social group.
Yeah, right.
And you're in and helping to really.
Yeah. So
Yeah, so
taking care of your
cognitive
grandkids.
Activities, like the analogous, the cognitive activities of the past, what is analogous to our current,
Right.
life?
Because when I think about cognitive demand, I think about like task switching and multitasking. Like that's
Yeah,
definitely not
I'll
good.
clarify what I'm talking about.
So can I retire if I babysit enough?
Yeah.
There's yes,
Fly you out.
but there's more. So this model would suggest that in our reproductive years, our sliders kept maximal, and then in our post-reproductive years, it's then driven by cognitive demands. So the good news here is that according to this model, this process is much more modifiable than we thought, that we can actually repair the hardware of the brain. But we have a lot of work to do, which I'll talk about in a minute. So what we want to do is essentially try to keep that slider at maximum position. And so we'll try to tie it all together in a way that explains how we got here and how we might get out of here. So I mentioned earlier that the evidence suggested that there's an environmental factor that's unique to adulthood that is driving this process. And we've talked about cognitive advance being a key driving force for brain health and cognitive function, thanks to its influence on our repair slider. So childhood is the time when that slider is at its highest position. So let's look at the demands that we place on the nervous system over the typical lifespan. And one thing that, so in childhood, we're faced with the task of building all of the neural machinery, all the neural networks that are required to be a functioning, independent adult. It's really complicated. That includes building the 3 most cognitively sophisticated networks we'll probably ever possess: learning to walk, learning to talk, and learning social behaviors, which dwarfs brain games and crossword puzzles.
So bypass that walk.
That's right.
Don't let 'em-
We're just learning to speak Chinese. All that,
Yeah.
right? Is that as high as that?
According to the nun study.
Yeah.
It's better. So I like to think of learning as scripted and unscripted. So scripted learning is the stuff that's encoded in our genomes. It's all those things that unfold during development in stereotyped, predictable fashion. Our most complicated things we do, really, really high success rate because evolution has made the whole process, the learning process, foolproof, unless we get in the way. And then, so that alone guarantees that our nervous system is going to be in a highly demanding environment throughout our childhood. And all scripted learning occurs in early life. So that alone is tipping the balance in favor of childhood. We also have, on the other side, unscripting learning. So that would refer to us acquiring new capabilities via our general purpose learning machinery. So types of unscripted learning would be skilled motor tasks like riding a bike, skateboarding, ice skating, skill sports, music and performing arts, those being some of the highest challenging in terms of the amount of cognitive cortical real estate that they engage. And then sort of moderate challenging activities, academic subjects, writing, reading, math, learning a second language, maybe learning a trade or craft. This is my own classification. But most unscripted learning also occurs in early life. And this is for a variety of reasons. It doesn't have to be this way. But we have cultural factors. Our societal architecture is heavily set up to front load unscripted learning. So we think of education as being for the young, and then work is where you go to learn, to perform the things that you learned in school. We also front load our skill learning. Most of the gymnastics classes, dance classes, and so forth are directed towards kids. There are psychological factors that limit this, that limit our unscripted learning as adults. The adults won't like feeling incompetent. That tends to worsen with age. So resist novelty and resist things that make them feel less competent. And there's also been a very persistent myth that adult brains have limited learning potential. Thankfully, thanks to Merzenich work, who cited earlier, for ushering in the neuroplasticity era, that is fading. We recognize that the adult brain is much more capable of learning new things and learning complex skills throughout our lifespan, but that's still a mindset limitation. And then the other thing we're doing in childhood is we're building up these really complicated perceptual systems from scratch. The biggest ones, the most complex ones being our vision, auditory, and proprioceptive systems. So at birth, you know, the world is, our sensory input is entirely undifferentiated. So we have to, in order for us to acquire those scripted behaviors, we have to build these perceptual systems that can finally discriminate sensory information, integrate it with other information. So this requires intense focus on complex, information-dense sensory stimuli in an attempt to build these structures that can then create these discriminatory networks. So for example, we all look at this scene and we immediately identify all the features, right? But to an infant, this is just a blob of colors. So all of the neural machinery that allows you to tag everything in that picture, understand what's going on, has to be constructed from scratch. And you do that by paying very close attention to your environment all the time, with dense sensory stimuli that you care a lot about. So to sum that up, we're continuously focusing intently on complex, personally relevant, and we care about it, stimuli in childhood, so that we can build perceptual systems that can extract meaning from it. Another force working against this is the phenomenon of automaticity. So anytime you're beginning to learn a new skill, you don't have any dedicated neural network devoted to its execution. So anytime you're learning something new, it's really demanding, it's resource intensive, you have to focus exclusively on it. This is in neuropsychology, is referred to as the phase of conscious incompetence. You know you suck at something. And then once you've learned it, you create a skill-specific network in the brain. It's been referred to as a zombie subroutine. So it can be now executed without any participation of your conscious mind. So it becomes less demanding and less resource intensive. I mean, you can do things while you're do that activity while your conscious mind is entirely otherwise engaged. So the analogy I often use is driving. So if you ever see a novice driver, it's completely overwhelming. Yet all of us can drive a car while carrying on a conversation easily now, and that's because of this process. And it takes us a lot less brain for us to drive than it took us when we first started. So we might perceive this as kind of the demands we place on the nervous system over time. I would argue it's about like this. So you have, in the beginning, our scripted development, followed by unscripted learning, and then we drop off a cliff, we go to work, and then we stop learning, and then once we hit that better off dead zone, once our capacity restricts the scope of what we can actually do, the decline accelerates. So this would suggest that the dramatic drop in cognitive demands in typical adulthood drives age-related cognitive decline and age-related dementia. Another graph just showing the discrepancy between, and I would argue that given what you talked about with the disparity between childhood and adulthood, and especially the complexity of the skills that we're learning, even what we consider to be a cognitively active adult is still a far cry from anything we do when we're kids. So to summarize, in order to work against the forces that are conspiring to hasten your neurobiological demise, this is why I said earlier we have a lot of work to do. We have all these forces to resist, to swim upstream. So we have genetic forces, which mean that all of our scripted learning is going to be in childhood, which is a huge demand to our nervous system. We have cultural factors, so education, learning new skills and talents is for young people. Then you go to work. Also, I didn't mention this, but we also have this prevailing belief that when you have a deficit, when you have a decline, you should do something to compensate for it, which only further diminishes the demands on your nervous system. There are psychological factors, the fixed mindset, the idea that you can't learn new things when you're older, the brain can't change, and that our tolerance for incompetence diminishes with age. Kids don't care if they suck at something. Young ones. You can watch it evolve.
Right, right, I see.
And we probably influence that. And then neurophysiological. So like we talked about earlier, over time, this is a great thing. It allows us to compound knowledge, automaticity, but it also means that you can use less brain to achieve the same result. So I was, right when I was thinking about this talk, I played a tennis match, and it was like a long 3-set match against another guy. We were walking off the court, and he was like so tired. He's like, I think people should mainly play doubles as they get older. Meaning like we were too demanding to play singles. And I was like, that just encapsulates everything. It's like, no. I said, I agree. So here's the challenge in a nutshell. As we get older, we progressively reduce the demands we place on our nervous system. Yet, as we get older, it becomes progressively more important to increase the demands we place on our nervous system. So our cognitively undemanding lives are the cause, and they hold the key to the solution. So once again, our goal here, if we want to fight this process, is to keep the repair slider maximally on. How? By trying to recreate the childhood learning milieu. That's the best thing I can come up with. Concept. So through the continuous acquisition of complex skills and cognitive capacities, and the continuous development of novel, complex, perceptual, discriminatory skills. So ideally, that would be baked into the process of learning a new complex skill. You can think of that as learning a novel, complex, perceptual, discriminatory skill. So you can imagine listening to white noise as being not a novel stimulus, not complex, not something you care about, versus listening to a symphony orchestra being complex, but you may or may not care about it. So if it's background music, you're just listening into the background, versus listening to a symphony and trying to extract the violin part and score it or whatever. So that would require you to build a perceptual system that would allow you to extract that information. This was going to be an awesome slide, but I didn't get to finish it. So next time. But this is my map of the various kinds of activities and where they would fall along the cognitive domain spectrum.
So learn a new musical instrument instead of continue playing your present instrument. Learn a new language.
So learning something new is higher on the
travel where you have to
novel. Yep.
Find your way without talking to Siri.
Right. Yep.
Oh my God.
Being able to read the signs.
Yep. So, but the take-home message from now on is so I think we have a bias in terms of what we've considered as cognitive activities. It's far more just thinky things. We usually think of it as solving puzzles and playing games. But if we think about the childhood learning environment, it's way more than that. And we kind of equate stuff we did in school with cognitive activity, but it's much broader than that, and it's probably not going to move the needle. So this is the difference between kind of this approach and approach of modern medicine. Right now, we're trying to identify every pathological disruption that's associated with these conditions and see if we can patch it up and fix them ourselves, even though we don't understand any of them. So, and then this model would say, like we said, the philosophical differences between ancestral health and modern medicine is trying to figure out how we can give the body what it needs to solve its own problems. So that would be turning the repair slider up with a cognitively demanding life and letting the brain figure out how to maintain its structure.
Quadrant 1 instead of quadrant 4.
Exactly.
What did you say?
The quadrant's quadrant 1 instead of quadrant 4.
And so, if you remember nothing else, remember that I think we've vastly underestimated the relative importance of the declining forces of order, the declining repair signal, and that mismatch reduction alone without the repair signal won't work. So it's the equivalent of eating more protein to build muscle without resistance training. And we've also underestimated the disparity between nervous system demands between the early life and adulthood. And we've too narrowly defined what we consider cognitive activities. So this is a summary in picture. So there's our graph of our typical cognitive demands over time, driving our slider to the left. There goes our out of balance. We're in our vicious cycle. We get a shriveled brain. Even if we add in quadrant 1, mismatch reduction, we can't arrest this process because we still have an imbalance in our scales. So we want to add in keeping the repair slider, which would be, I would consider in the model, the quadrant model, a quadrant 2 intervention. So we're exploiting a known physiologic mechanism with a game level intervention. One reason why mismatch alone may not work in that scenario is you have declining forces in natural selection. So anyhow, that's the algorithm for maintaining a robust, healthy brain. Summarize, stay curious, pay attention. It's great to suck at things. So, don't forget that the world is amazing and keep coming to the PH.